I'm joined now by Lord Darroch, who's going to talk to us about this big and bold step that I think Ukraine's pretty pleased about, actually, from the briefing that's been coming out overnight about them having this opportunity to potentially become part of the European Union family. Lord Darroch, is this a positive step for Ukraine and Moldova?
It is, Jake. It's an important, but primarily at this stage, it's a political signal for them. They've in effect, they've jumped the queue because there were several countries that had had longer standing applications for starting accession negotiations. And what the EU has done, because of what Ukraine is going through with the war with Russia, is lifted up the queue and said, we will start accession negotiations with you soon. Now, these negotiations could take a decade, could take longer. So it's not like the Ukrainians will be in the EU, at the end of next year or anything, but it's an important political signal, and Zelensky has welcomed it, as he should, although the other part of the EU decision last night was Hungary blocking some 50 billion euros of aid to Ukraine. So it's not an entirely good story for Zelensky this morning.
No, but obviously these things can't be viewed in isolation, Lord Darroch. And, isn't this, along with rumours which never actually came to pass, that Ukraine was contemplating being part of NATO, or NATO was contemplating having Ukraine as one of its members, isn't this a bit of a red rag to Russia, President Putin, who is continuing to conduct his illegal war in Ukraine?
It is. Look, I think the thing that Putin will care most about is the real crisis for Ukraine, which is whether or not the American Congress unblocks military aid from the States to Ukraine. Because if Ukraine doesn't get that US military aid, then the likelihood is they will lose the war. So that's, in a sense, the thing that Putin, I think, would care most about. But he won't like the idea that Ukraine is now set on a course that makes it firmly part of the West and of Western structures. So he will be unhappy about this, but he'll be watching what's going on in Washington with the most attention, I think, at the moment.
And of course, you're referring to that £61 billion package that is currently being held up in the United States. And David Cameron has said that the best Christmas present we can give is to pass both the EU and the USA aid packages. Ukraine's a huge country. It's a huge economy. It will have, at the end of the war, one of the biggest land armies, certainly in Europe, certainly the most battle-hardened. But it is a country that looks both east and west in terms of its population, in terms of its journey into the European Union, which, as you say, may take up to a decade. Have we got recent examples from the history of the expansion of the European Union that sort of point to how we can take a sort of east and west facing country into that family of nations?
It's a good question, Jack. The Central European countries came into the European Union in 2005. The biggest of those, with a population of something around 40 million, was Poland. But you would still argue that Poland is not like Ukraine. Poland has been westward oriented ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it doesn't have a border with Russia in the way that Ukraine does. So there isn't an exact parallel. The other great point about Ukraine is it's still a relatively poor country, and I shall be interested to see over the next decade whether the free movement rules that the EU has in place survive untouched, unamended when Ukraine comes in, because the risk otherwise, I think, of a large percentage, as a lot of Central Europeans did, coming into Western Europe for the better paid jobs that are there, you'd wonder whether quite a lot of Ukrainians wouldn't do that too. So I think there's some big questions around how the EU can absorb a country like Ukraine. Plus, of course, Ukraine needs to have settled borders before it can come in, and that means somehow or other this war with Putin's Russia has to be resolved.
And Lord Darroch, We heard from David Cameron yesterday. He was talking about the heat and anger having gone out of the debate about the European Union here in the UK. And of course, you were the British ambassador to the EU. Do you think, do you agree with David Cameron, first of all, but also do you think he can really speak with credibility given his former position standing against Brexit?
Yeah. Look, I worked for David Cameron as his national security advisor for 3.5 years, and he was a pleasure to work for. I'm an admirer, and I think he'll make a very good foreign secretary. I think on the facts, Jake, he is right in that relations between the UK and the EU have improved, quite strikingly in the last year or so, on the back of two things. One is the Windsor Agreement that Sunak negotiated. And the other is the war in Ukraine has necessity brought the UK and Europe closer together. There's a lot more channels opened up discussing what we're doing on sanctions, what we're doing on military aid, what we're doing on Ukrainian refugees, and so on. So he is right that the relationship is better. You're also right, though, that he will be remembered around Europe as the man who launched the referendum on Brexit, who supported Remain, as you say, and then lost the referendum. And that will always be a sort of label that he carries when talking to his European counterparts.
Yeah, and finally, Lord Darroch, if I may, we've been talking here on TalkTV today about the ongoing migrant crisis following the tragic death that we've learnt about overnight in the Channel after a dinghy capsized. One of the things we've been discussing, we are holding lots of global conferences. We've just seen COP28. The Prime Minister Rishi Sunak held a global conference on AI. This global migrant crisis, which we have been described as being in the foothills only of, is this something that our Prime Minister and our Foreign Secretary David Cameron could take a global lead on? And is there an argument for them to try and pull the nations around Europe and the world beyond together to try and seek one wide-ranging solution to this crisis that is going to, probably dominate the political discourse of Western Europe over the next decade or two?
I agree with your analysis. I think, first of all, this is the leading problem of the moment for governments across the West. Second, I think it is going to get worse. I think climate change is going to make it worse. The current global instability, whether it's Gaza in the Middle East and the risk of that escalating, or the war in Ukraine, is going to make the illegal migration crisis bigger. And it's not just Europe, of course. If you look at America, they have a huge problem on their southern border. So it's a problem that is transatlantic. Yes, it can only be solved, as one of your commentators has said, by international cooperation. You can do things nationally. I think a lot of Europe are watching British government's efforts now to find a way through it on the problem. But ultimately, it can only be solved by international cooperation, and it can only be solved in the long term by improving the conditions in the countries from which migrants are coming. And so that does raise into the question the whole effectiveness of our international aid programme, how it's spent and whether it can be better spent.
Thank you so much to the former British ambassador to the EU, Lord Kim Darroch. Mike and Chloe are still with me. Mike, I think he was talking about you then. He said one of our commentators had suggested this global summit. It was me. It was me. I'm claiming that one. It was me who suggested that, but I think you brought it up in the first place. Look, really interesting. Let's talk about Ukraine first of all. This makes me a bit nervous, this idea that he doesn't need any egging on President Putin. I'm not saying for one moment that we should back down, but this EU accession next step, it's really waving the red rag at the bull. Mike, do you think it's been the right thing for the EU to do?
I think it's absolutely the right thing for the EU to do. And it's both a statement of commitment to Ukraine and to Zelensky, but it is also a statement to Putin of the fact that the West is, well, certainly the EU is saying we're not backing down. We're not giving up on Ukraine. Ukraine is an independent nation. It can make its own choices about whether it wants to head, face east or face west, and it chose a long time ago to face west. So I'm very, very glad that the EU has made this move.
Large parts of the Ukraine chose to face west. Historically, the Donetsk region and other areas where they've got a big Russian-speaking population did traditionally face more east. Now, those areas, many of those regions have been completely illegally annexed by Russia as part of their illegal war in Ukraine. I cannot believe for one second that if they are liberated by the very, very brave Ukrainians who are fighting to do so, that they will ever look to Russia ever again, given the atrocities that we've heard about. But the other big challenge for the EU is Ukraine is the agricultural powerhouse of Europe, producing vast quantities, in fact, the lion's share of the global grain supply. Is the EU capable of absorbing a country like that into its family? Because, of course, they have the common agricultural policy and its successors, which really provide big agricultural subsidies. So Ukraine immediately would be a big drain on EU resources.
I mean, I think inevitably it will mean change. I mean, Kim Darroch just said may well mean change to the freedom of movement rules, and that's quite possible. But as you say, it may well lead to change in terms of the budget of the EU and how that is formed, and of the common agricultural policy as well. But the EU is walking into this with its eyes open. I mean, they'll be very aware that these changes are likely necessary, but they've decided to do it anyway, for the good of the people of Ukraine.
And it will take place over 10 years. So
it will take place over at least 10 years. I mean, quite possibly longer because, I mean, as you've both said...
Because it's the EU.